The wind came in sharp from the north, dry and bitter, peeling at her skin like it wanted something from her. Sagebrush scraped her skirts. Her boots sank into the dust, soft with drought. The road behind her stretched thin as thread, already half swallowed by the rise of heat and emptiness. The baby on her hip had gone quiet, breath hitching now and again like he was too tired to cry. The other 5 followed behind, barefoot, red-faced, and silent. There was no town, no sign, just a weather-worn fence post leaning like it had given up. She pressed one hand to her brow and squinted west. The land out there was folded and pale, sun-blasted hills stitched with animal trails. Somewhere past them was water, she thought, or had been. The man who gave her the map had said 8 miles. That had been 2 days ago. Her name was Ruth. She had not spoken it aloud in weeks. Her voice had grown dry with silence, the way bread crusts over if you leave it too long on the table. Her husband had taken the horse, said he'd ride ahead, find the well, come back for them. That had been 4 days back, maybe 5. The heat made time slippery. A wheeze rose in her chest. She stifled it. The children must not see fear. Fear was a crack in the dam, and she'd seen what happened when women let it show. Her mother had folded once like that. Afterward, Ruth had learned to keep her back straight even when her legs buckled. You kept walking. You kept the babies fed. You didn't look back. The oldest, a boy of maybe 10, stumbled beside her. "Ma," he whispered. His lips were cracked, his eyes sunburned at the corners. She reached for his hand, felt how small it still was in her own. She squeezed it, then let go. A shape moved in the distance. It wasn't the wind or a deer nor anything the land would made on its own. Too tall, too still. A horse, yes. A man on it. Watching. She froze. Dust stuck to her sweat-drenched skin. He didn't come closer. She stepped forward, heart pounding harder than it had in days. The baby stirred and whimpered, the sound weak as wind through dry grass. "Please," she said, voice scraping out of her like bark. "We just need—" The man nudged his horse forward, slow, careful. He wore a duster, long and dark, though the heat rose in shimmering waves. His hat threw shadow over his face, but his eyes were clear when he came close. Blue, sharp, but not cruel. He looked at the children first. "Where you headed?" he asked. She licked her lips. "West. To where the river bends. They said there's a place with a pump and maybe a house." His gaze moved to the baby, then to her boots. He saw what he needed to. "There ain't no water that way. Not anymore." Ruth didn't answer. Her breath left her like she'd been struck. The boy beside her sat down hard in the dirt, legs giving out. The man looked past her, then back. "You got people?" She shook her head. "You got anything left?" She thought of the coins sewn into her hem. Not enough. She thought of the letter in her pocket, ink washed nearly blank from sweat. A brother in Montana. Or maybe it was Wyoming. She hadn't read it in weeks. "We're just trying to get through," she said. He looked down for a moment, then back up. "This land don't give a damn about trying." "Neither do men," she almost said. But she didn't. He swung off his horse. The dust shivered around his boots. The kids stepped back, except the little girl who just stared, thumb in her mouth. He knelt, pulled a canteen from his saddle, and handed it to Ruth without a word. It was heavier than she expected. She swallowed once, then passed it to the boy. "You got a name?" the man asked. She nodded. "Ruth." He didn't offer his. Just looked once more at the heat-rippled road behind her, then at the kids. "Come on," he said finally. "Ain't much, but it's better than dying out here." She didn't move right away. Something inside her still wanted to believe in the direction she'd been going, that if she just walked a little farther she'd find what she'd been promised. But the silence told her the truth. She followed. The trail he led them on was barely a path, just a slight press of hoofprints and dry indentations weaving through the sage. It wound through a shallow draw, shielded some from the worst of the wind. The sun clawed its way higher, but the land offered no shelter. Still, Ruth felt something in her shoulders ease, like she'd been holding a breath so long she'd forgotten what air felt like. The man didn't speak again for nearly an hour. He walked ahead, reins looped over one hand, the other resting near his hip. She watched how he moved. He walked like a man who'd spent most of his life listening to silence, not fighting it. She wondered what had broken him and whether it had healed clean or crooked. At a bend in the trail he stopped and turned. "You can ride," he said, nodding at the horse. Ruth looked at the children. "We'll walk. You'll fall. I've already fallen." His eyes met hers for a beat longer than comfort allowed. He gave a small nod, not in agreement but in recognition. He understood something about her now. Not everything. Just enough. He swung the smallest girl up in one arm. She squealed softly, surprised, and set her on the saddle before helping Ruth mount with the baby. Then he hoisted the boy behind her and took the reins again, walking steady beside the horse, his back straight under the weight of silence. By late afternoon they reached a small rise overlooking a shallow basin. Tucked in its center was a cabin, weather gray low to the ground, with a lean-to and a collapsed fence stretching like tired arms on either side. Smoke curled faint from the chimney. 2 goats wandered near the corral. A dog barked once sharp and hoarse, then fell silent. The man pointed. "You can rest there. Yours." He gave a short nod. "For now." A woman might have asked more. Ruth didn't. She'd learned to accept kindness like river water sip when you don't question the source too hard. Inside the cabin smelled of wood smoke and old wool. There were blankets on the floor, a stove, and a basin filled half with water. A single photograph sat face down on the mantel. The children collapsed in the corner without a word, asleep almost before their bodies hit the floor. Ruth stood in the doorway, rocking the baby slow. He poured water into a tin cup, handed it to her. "Name's Eli," he said. She nodded. "Thank you. You got a man." "He left," she said. "That mean he's dead?" "No, just gone." Ellie didn't flinch at the answer. He looked at the children. "Yours?" "All 6. He gave a soft whistle. "That's something." She waited, expecting a joke or judgment. It didn't come. Instead he said, "I'll boil more water. You'll want to clean their feet." She lowered her gaze. "You don't have to help us." "I know." He stepped out to the lean-to, returning with wood and a kettle. She watched him move, precise, without waste. A man used to quiet work. She knelt beside the stove, reached for the kettle he offered. Their hands brushed. A flicker of warmth passed between them, brief but solid. He stepped back. That night Ruth sat up long after the children had curled into each other like puppies. The wind pushed at the corners of the house the way it always did when the plains were restless. Eli sat across from her at the table, whittling something small, a horse maybe, or a bird. "You ever lose anyone?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Yes." "How'd you live with it?" "I didn't. Not for a while." Ruth nodded. "I don't ask where people come from," he said, "just whether they mean to stay." "I don't know yet." He set the carving down. "Well, you're here now." And for the first time in weeks, Ruth felt the heat of something not cruel, not salvation, not yet, but something like a pause in the pain, a place to sit, to breathe. Outside the goats shifted. The wind moved on. The dog barked once, and then quieted again. Subscribe and keep pace with the frontier. The next morning Ruth woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of the door creaking open. Light cut across the wooden floor in a sharp line, catching dust motes in its wake. Eli stood outside, his silhouette leaning against the post, sipping from a tin cup. The sky beyond him was pale and clean, the kind of dawn that comes only after a punishing heat. She moved quietly, careful not to wake the children, and stepped out beside him. "You sleep?" he asked. "A little." He handed her the cup. The coffee was hot, bitter, and honest. She drank. "You don't have to stay," he said after a while, still watching the horizon. She followed his gaze. The land stretched wide and indifferent, but there was something calming in its emptiness, a kind of steadiness. No lies out there, just what was and what wasn't. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said. Ellie nodded once. Over the next days they found rhythm. Ruth swept the cabin floor and washed what clothes they had left. She taught the younger children how to fetch goat milk without spooking the animals. Eli showed the older boy Samuel how to check the fence line, how to spot fresh tracks, how to handle a hatchet without losing a finger. It was not easy. The work never ended, and the smallest girl cried at night for reasons she couldn't name. But it was life, not just surviving. That was new. One afternoon, Ruth helped Eli patch the roof. The sun was relentless and sweat rolled down her back in thin, itchy lines. She held the nails in her mouth, like he showed her past them to him one at a time. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked, not looking at him. He paused. "Used to." "What stopped you?" "No one waiting anywhere else." She nodded. Her hands ached. She'd blistered her palms pulling splinters from a beam that morning, and now every press of her skin against the rough wood stung. Later he brought out a jar of something sweet, peach preserves saved from the last good year, and offered a spoonful to each of the children. When Ruth hesitated, he raised the spoon toward her without a word. She took it. That night after the children slept, she stayed outside while Eli carved. The moon hung low and orange, and the firelight danced across his face. "You married?" she asked. Was. What happened?" "She died 6 years ago." "I'm sorry." He nodded, jaw tight. "Wasn't quick." They didn't speak again for a long time. The fire crackled and a coyote howled somewhere far off. Ruth watched the coals shift and fall. "You're kind to them," she said quietly. "To the kids." "I didn't think I'd ever have a house full of children again." She smiled, tired and real. "Neither did I." He looked at her then. Really looked. Not like a man seeing a woman, but like someone seeing something fragile and fierce all at once. A thing that shouldn't have survived but did. "You're stronger than you look," he said. "I had to be." The next morning she rose before dawn. The baby stirred in her arms, sucking at nothing. She pressed her lips to his forehead, then stepped out into the cold. Eli was already saddling the horse. "Fence is down again," he said. "Coyotes, probably. I'll come." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to." "I know." She mounted behind him. The land was waking slow around them, and in the hush, before the heat, Ruth felt something she hadn't in years. Not hope, but the beginning of it. They rode out together, the horse's gait slow, and even the air still clinging to the last scraps of night. Ruth held to the saddle with one hand and kept the other across the baby's back, his little chest rising steady against her ribs. The boy had grown quieter in the past 2 days. Not weak, just watchful, like he was learning how to breathe in a world that might keep him. Eli didn't talk much as they rode. He pointed once to a break in the fence where the post leaned like a drunk against the wind. Another time to a patch of torn ground, cloven prints pressed into the dust. "Only one coyote," he said. "Could have been worse." They stopped by a dead goat near the edge of the field. It had been mauled but not eaten, just torn for the sake of tearing. Ruth covered the baby's eyes even though he didn't yet know what he was seeing. Eli crouched beside the carcass and let out a breath. "You want me to move him?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. Let me." She didn't insist. She knew the look on his face, tight-lipped, half-shamed. Men had their own ways of mourning. Sometimes they didn't even know that's what they were doing. He dug a shallow hole with his hands, then used a flat stone to widen it. His knuckles bled. Ruth didn't say a word. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was full and high. The children were gathered around the stove, and Samuel was trying to boil oats without burning the pot. Ruth stepped in and guided his hands. "You're learning," she said. He looked up at her cheeks, red with effort. "Is he gonna stay with us?" "Who?" "The cowboy." She hesitated. "He's letting us stay with him. But for how long?" Ruth glanced at the door where Eli had paused just outside, listening without pretending not to. She crossed the floor, took the pot off the stove, and stirred it once more. "For as long as he wants," she said finally. That afternoon, Eli asked her to ride out to the trading post with him. Said they needed flour and salt and maybe a bolt of muslin if she was set on mending the kids' clothes. She agreed. It was a half-day ride over cracked open plain. Yellow grass whispered under the hooves. Ruth hadn't seen another human face in weeks, and the thought of strangers made her chest tighten. "You're good with them," Ellie said after a long stretch of silence. "The children?" He nodded. "They're mine. What choice do I have?" He looked sideways at her. "Plenty of women leave. Or drink. Or die. I'm not plenty of women." He gave a half-smile. "No, you're not." The trading post was little more than a squat building with a crooked sign and a pale flag that hung like a tired arm. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco, sweat, and cracked leather. A wiry man behind the counter raised an eyebrow as they entered. "Thought you were done with people," he said to Eli. "Not yet." His eyes flicked to Ruth, then back. "That yours?" Ellie didn't answer. Ruth lifted her chin. "We're with him." The man nodded, not kindly, not cruelly. Just the way someone nods at a storm they didn't expect but have no power to stop. They bought what they could. Salt, sugar, oats, and a jar of dried apples that Ruth had to put back after counting out what coins she had left. Eli handed her the jar again. "You've already done too much," she whispered. "I don't keep tally," he said. The ride back was quiet. The baby slept against her chest, and Ruth watched the way the sun moved across the land inch by inch as if it were looking for something lost. When they returned, the cabin felt more like a home than it ever had. The children were loud and dirty and grinning. Samuel had managed to catch a rabbit, and the smallest girl had made a necklace out of string and beans. That night Ruth sat beside Eli on the porch while the air cooled and the crickets sang. "You want us gone?" she asked him. He didn't answer right away. "I wanted silence," he said. "I thought that would save me. And, I was wrong." She turned toward him, but he didn't look at her. He just kept his eyes on the horizon where the stars were starting to show. A week passed. Then another. Time lost its sharp edges. Each morning Ruth rose before the sun and lit the stove. The children stirred in their sleep, their bodies sprawled across blankets and straw-filled ticking. The scent of wood smoke clung to everything now, her hair, their clothes, the baby's soft breath. Eli taught Samuel how to saddle the horse without startling it, how to oil a rifle, how to tell the difference between fear and instinct in an animal's eyes. Ruth watched from the doorway, arms folded, the baby on her hip. Her boy was growing into something sturdy, something sure. That mattered. Eli didn't touch her, not once. But some days she'd catch him watching her hands as she braided her oldest daughter's hair or stitched a patch onto one of the boys' shirts. There was a kind of reverence in his eyes, quiet and searching, like he saw something there he hadn't known to look for. Late one night, after the children had fallen asleep and the coals burned low in the stove, Eli set a tin cup in front of her. Inside was wild honey he'd bartered for. She stared at it a long time before tasting it. The sweetness hit her so fast it nearly hurt. "No one's ever given me anything I didn't have to pay for," she said. "I don't want anything from you," he replied. She believed him. That terrified her more than a lie would have. The weather turned. Dry wind gave way to hard rain. The children caught coughs. Ruth sat up, nights rubbing salve on their chests, whispering the same song her mother had once hummed in the dark. Eli brought in extra firewood, stayed near but didn't hover. When the storm passed, they rowed out to check the water barrels. One had cracked. The other was half full. On the way back, Eli said, "I used to think if I kept everything small, just me, just this land, I could control it. Keep it from breaking. Did it work?" He shook his head. "Turns out pain doesn't care how wide the fence is." They rode in silence for a while, the sound of hooves steady in the soft earth. "My father told me I'd be nothing without a man," Ruth said. Eli looked at her and she felt the heat of it down to her ribs. "He was wrong," he said. The next morning a rider came. Ruth was in the garden, knees deep in soil, coaxing beans from the dry earth. She heard the hoofbeats, first sharp and urgent, then saw the dust rise along the fence line. She wiped her hands on her skirt and stood. Eli came from the barn, rifle in hand, but low. The rider slowed, a man in a black vest, face, lean eyes darting. He looked at Ruth, then at Eli, then back at Ruth again. "You Ruth Miller." She tensed. "Who's asking?" "Name's Graves. Your husband sent me." Eli took one step forward, rifle still low. Ruth didn't move. Graves pulled something from his coat. A letter, sealed with dirt and dried blood. "He's hurt," Graves said. "Somewhere near Dry Creek. Sent me to fetch you." She took the letter but didn't open it. "When did you see him last?" she asked. 3 days ago. Said he got into something bad. Said he was sorry." Graves looked past her toward the children gathered at the door of the cabin, peeking through slats. "He wants you to come." Eli didn't speak. His face had gone flat. Not hard, just unreadable. Ruth looked at the letter. Then at the land behind her. The fence. The bean sprouts. The children. She folded the letter in half and tucked it into her apron. "You tell him I already buried him once," she said. Graves blinked. "Ma'am." She stepped forward. "You tell him I've got mouths to feed and a roof to hold up. If he wanted forgiveness, he should have brought bread, not words." Graves opened his mouth, then shut it. He looked at Eli like he wanted to say something else but thought better of it. He turned the horse, kicked once, and rode off without another word. Ruth stood there long after the dust had settled. Eli didn't speak, didn't touch her. He just stood nearby, solid as stone. Finally she said, "I chose wrong once. I won't again." He nodded. "You didn't choose wrong today?" The sun moved overhead. The children called for her. Life waiting. She turned toward it. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind had gone quiet and the stillness sat heavy. Ruth lay with her eyes open, staring at the roof, listening to the slow breath of 6 sleeping children. The letter sat folded under her pillow. She hadn't read it. Didn't need to. She knew the shape of his words before they were ever written. Outside, the porch creaked. She rose, pulled her shawl over her shoulders, and stepped out. Eli was sitting in his usual spot, whittling a sliver of cedar. He didn't look at her when she sat beside him. He didn't have to. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "What?" "For not asking me to go. For not saying it was my duty." He set the carving down, a small bird, this time its wings half finished, and looked out at the dark. I saw his kind before, Eli said. Plenty of them. Full of promises. Light when they arrive, heavy when they leave. She nodded. He wasn't always like that. Neither was I. She glanced sideways at him. You ever think about what you'd be if you hadn't come here? Sometimes. He rubbed his thumb across a nick on his hand. I used to think I'd build something bigger. More land, more cattle, more noise. But I lost too much too fast. It changed the shape of what I could want. And now? He looked at her, and there was something in his gaze that was both tender and unflinching. Now I want what I can hold, he said. Ruth didn't reply, but her hands found her lap, fingers folding into themselves. She thought of how little she'd had control over. Her body, her babies, her future. All of it had been handed from man to man like a parcel wrapped in string. But here now no one was holding her. No one was claiming her. Just a man with rough hands and a quiet way who gave without demand. The moon hung low, its light silvering the fields. She could hear the goats shifting in the barn, the creak of the cabin settling, the whisper of Eli's breath. He spoke again, softer this time. You don't owe me anything, Ruth. You stay if you want. You leave if you must. She turned to him then. Not fast. Just sure. I want to stay. His face didn't change much, but she saw the weight lift from it, slow and steady like sun burning off frost. You're not alone here, he said. No, she replied. I'm not. In the morning she washed the children's clothes and hung them along the fence. Samuel carried water from the barrel without being asked. The smallest girl followed Ellie around with a stick, pretending it was a horse. Ruth caught herself smiling in open, easy things she didn't recognize. Later that day, Eli brought her a gift. A wooden comb, carved smooth, small flowers etched along the back. Her breath caught when she turned it in her hand. I thought you could use something that was just yours, he said. She ran her fingers along the teeth of it, then looked up at him. I haven't had anything of mine in a long time. You do now. In the weeks that followed, life settled into something close to peace. The garden grew. Ruth taught the older girls how to sew and the boys how to read from a Bible missing its cover. Eli repaired the roof and built a proper co-op for the chickens he bartered off a trader. They were poor, but they were building something. One night, as she stood by the stove, the baby in one arm and a pot of beans bubbling beside her, Ruth felt Ellie's hand on her back. Light, careful, but there. I've been thinking, he said. Dangerous thing, she teased. He smiled. I want to build a new room for the children. Bigger, warmer. She blinked. Why? Because they're here, and you're here. And I figure it's time I made room for what matters. The words lodged in her chest, full and bright. Later, after the children were down and the house had gone quiet, Ruth stepped out into the night and found him again on the porch. She sat beside him, the comb tucked into her pocket, and rested her head on his shoulder. You sure? She asked. I'm sure, he said. And in the silence that followed, the world finally felt wide enough to hold them both. The summer passed slow and golden. The land stayed dry but not cruel. The garden gave what it could. The goats birthed 2 kids in early August. The days blurred into each other, fence repairs, washing, schooling, meals that stretched a little farther than they should have. But no one went hungry. No one cried in the night anymore. Ruth worked from dawn till after the lamps went out. Yet she didn't feel hollow from it. She felt tethered, not to duty, but to something she'd helped make. The children laughed more. Samuel grew taller. The baby learned to walk, his steps wobbly but determined. Eli carved a bed frame from pine, fitted it into the new room he'd built with his own hands. Ruth sewed curtains from an old flour sack, added stitches in red thread where the light hit best. It was not grand, but it was honest. It smelled of wood and clean air and bread. One afternoon Ruth stood beside the corral watching Ellie mend a harness strap. He wore his sleeves, rolled his hat low the way he always did. She thought of the man he must have been before all this, the one who buried his wife, who vanished into silence. She thought of how gently he'd begun speaking to the children, how he fixed the broken things without being asked. When he caught her looking, he didn't smile. He just looked back steady. Later that night, after supper, Ruth brought out a tin box. Inside was a small length of blue ribbon, worn soft at the edges. She set it on the table between them. "My mother gave me that," she said to wear it when I needed to remember who I was. Eli glanced at it, then at her. "And who are you?" She smiled small. "Not who I used to be." He didn't reach for the ribbon. He reached for her hand. "I want to build this with you," he said. "Not just the room. Not just the house. The rest of it. If you'll have me." Ruth didn't cry. She'd done enough of that in her life. Instead, she took his hand and laced her fingers through his. It was the simplest thing she could do, and the most powerful. That Sunday they stood in the tall grass behind the cabin, with Samuel holding the baby and the younger girls clinging to Ruth's skirt. Eli wore a clean shirt. Ruth wore her mother's ribbon tied neat in her hair. A neighbor rode out to witness it, no preacher, just an old rancher who'd known Eli long enough to trust his word. They said vows with no book, just eyes and calloused hands and a quiet promise between them. Later, Ruth planted seeds behind the cabin. Not just beans or corn, but lilac, a single bush. The soil wasn't good for it and the rain might not come. But she planted it anyway. "Why that?" Eli asked, watching her pat the earth. "Because it's beautiful," she said. "And stubborn." He smiled. "Like someone I know." The children ran circles around them, kicking up dust and laughter. Inside, the fire crackled. The roof held. The walls stood. And Ruth, for the first time in all her years, felt not just safe, but chosen. Autumn crept in soft as breath. The wind turned cooler, brushing through the grass in long, low sighs. Mornings came silver with frost, and the cabin filled with the smells of boiling oats, wool drying by the stove, and wood smoke curling slow through the rafters. Ruth wrapped the children in blankets before sunrise, tucking them close as the cold crept in. Eli rose before anyone, splitting kindling in the yard, with his breath steaming and his muscles moving slow and sure. They spoke less now, not out of silence, but out of knowing. Words weren't needed for every kindness. A pot stirred at the right time. A coat hung near the door, his hand brushing hers when he passed her the coffee in the morning. One night, after the children were asleep and the cabin had gone still, Eli sat at the table with a small wooden box in front of him. Ruth watched him open it and pull something from inside. It was a ring. Not polished. Not bought. A plain, handmade circle of braided metal, rough at the edges, forged by his own hands. "I've got nothing fine to offer," he said, voice low. "No preacher. No silk. But I want you to have this. Not as proof, just a promise." Ruth stared at it. Her hands were still damp from the dishwater. Her knuckles were red. Her nails split. But she reached for it without hesitation. "I don't need fine," she said. "I've had fine. It didn't hold." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit just barely. The braid of the metal caught the light like river water. "You want me to say the words?" he asked. "No," she said, eyes shining. "I already believe you." The next morning, Samuel took the wagon into town with Eli for supplies. Ruth stayed behind, schooling the girls and boiling what was left of the summer potatoes. The baby napped in the sling on her chest, his breath warm against her neck. As she stirred the pot, the wind picked up. By late afternoon, dust came with it. Storms weren't rare this time of year. The sky went yellow, then gray, and the air thickened with grit. Ruth shuttered the windows and gathered the children close. The baby cried. One of the girls whimpered. She held them tight and sang under her breath. The song was old and off-key, but it kept their hearts steady. The wind knocked hard once, then went quiet. When the door opened, Ruth turned too fast. But it was Eli, hat in hand boots thick with mud. Samuel followed, eyes wide. "We're all right," Eli said before she could speak. "Just wind." Samuel ran to the baby. Eli crossed the floor and set a sack on the table. Inside were dried apples, salt, and a single length of blue fabric. Soft cotton. Sky-colored. "For a dress," Eli said. "Thought maybe you'd want something new." Ruth reached into the sack, pulled the fabric to her chest. "I don't need new." "I know," he said. "But maybe you deserve it." That night she stitched by lamplight while Eli read aloud from a book they'd found at the post, pages gone at the edges, but full of stories. The children huddled close, the girls braiding each other's hair, Samuel leaning on the floor, his chin in his hand. The baby had begun to babble in soft sounds that made no sense but filled the room with life. After they slept, Ruth stepped outside. The sky had cleared. Stars bloomed wide and sharp overhead. Behind her, she heard the door creak and felt Eli's warmth settle beside her. "Storm's past," he said. "For now." He nodded. "There'll be more." "Yes," she said. "But we'll be ready." She looked at her hand where the ring caught the starlight. A small thing. Not loud. Not glittering. But it stayed. And beside her stood a man who didn't promise the world, just stood with her in it. The first snow came early. Just a thin dusting at dawn, soft as flour but enough to hush the earth. Ruth stepped outside with a blanket around her shoulders and watched it settle across the fields. The air was sharp in her lungs, clean in a way that made her remember things she didn't want to. But the cabin behind her was warm, and there was coffee on the stove and Eli's boots beside the door. The children shrieked when they saw the snow. They ran barefoot into it, wild and laughing, slipping and chasing each other until Ruth called them in with red cheeks and wet hands. Samuel carried the baby like he was something holy. Maybe he was. Eli spent the morning chopping wood. His movements were slower now, not from weakness but from thoughtfulness. He wasn't trying to outrun grief anymore. He was making something, stacking it right, doing it once and doing it well. Inside, Ruth sat at the table, fixing the hem of the dress she'd made from the blue cloth. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. When she slipped it over her head and tied it at the back, the girls clapped and the baby squealed. She caught Eli watching her, one brow lifted like maybe he was seeing her for the first time all over again. "Shame to wear that just for goats and children," he said, grinning. She stepped close and brushed her hand across his chest. "You're here too." They had nothing and everything. A leaking roof some nights, a stew that stretched too thin, a fire that needed feeding before dawn. But Ruth had stopped counting what they lacked. It no longer mattered. Eli started drawing up plans for a root cellar. Said the winters could turn hard out here and he didn't want to be caught hungry again. Ruth helped him measure, her hands raw from the cold, her breath rising in little clouds. They worked together as the days shortened, side by side like they'd always done it. At night, when the children were asleep, Ruth told him things she hadn't said out loud in years, how her father drank, how her husband used to lock the door when he left so she wouldn't leave, how she'd once stolen sugar just to make a birthday cake for one of the boys. Eli didn't flinch. He didn't pity. He just listened, one hand resting lightly over hers. "I knew you were strong," he said once, "but I didn't know how deep it ran." She looked at him in the quiet and said it wasn't strength. It was need. I didn't want to die with nothing left of me. You haven't. The day before the second snow, Ellie returned from town with a box under his arm. Ruth raised an eyebrow but said nothing. That night after supper he handed it to her in front of the children. Inside was a book, blank pages, leather cover, a pencil tied to it with string. For what, she asked? For remembering. Ruth ran her hand over the first page. It felt too clean to touch. I've spent most of my life trying to forget, then write it down different, Ellie said. Start from here. And so she did. She wrote about the beans growing crooked, about Samuel learning to shoot, about the time the baby got into the flour and turned the whole cabin white, about Eli building her a bench near the goat pen because she liked to sit there and think. She wrote about the day she chose not to leave. Winter closed in slow, thick, and white. The land went quiet again. But this time, Ruth wasn't afraid of the silence. It wasn't emptiness, it was rest. She stood one morning by the fire, the ring warm on her hand, the baby asleep against her chest. The others played at her feet, building towers from firewood scraps. Ellie stepped in from the cold snow on his shoulders, eyes bright. He didn't speak. He just looked at her like he was still trying to believe she was real. And Ruth for once let herself believe it too. The journey isn't finished. Subscribe and ride on.